Today's episode is brought to you by LaRosse Media. They make professional videos to fit any budget, so next time you need a commercial, promo, or corporate video, think LaRosse. Check them out at larossemedia.com. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Stinking Albatross Podcast. My name is Alyssa Globe, and I'm here once again with my partner in crime, Scott Hayward. How's it going, Scott?
It's going well, Alyssa. How are you? It's been a minute since we've done this podcast, eh?
It has been a minute because we've actually been preparing for our summer speaker series. So every time we release a podcast episode, it's going to be with a new guest. And we actually have a special guest today, and that is Julia Malott. For those of you who don't know Julia, active on Twitter, very outspoken on transgender issues. And so we're really excited to have a good conversation and delve into some of these policies that's been happening across Canada. So thanks for coming on, Julia.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm excited for today's discussion.
So the first question I have is, you've become a little bit more outspoken in the last, few months, I guess, since the beginning of the year. And in one of the interviews that I listened to with you, you said it kind of started with the Nick Morabito situation in Ottawa. So I just wanted to ask you, in your words, what happened in that situation and why did that kind of trigger you to become more involved in this?
Sure, absolutely. So Nick Morabito, he is a parent in Ottawa, Ontario, and I live south of Toronto. So I'm not that close to Ottawa, but I do a lot of work across many of our school boards in Ontario right now, talking about transgender matters and trying to find balance to this conversation. I've certainly found that we seem to have reached a point where we're just not allowed to talk about these things. And a lot of things are being labeled transphobic or hateful when it's really just questions or differing opinions. And I think there's always space to have those conversations. And I haven't liked seeing the way that speech has been restricted. So I've done work at a number of boards in southwestern Ontario. And then in early March, Nick Morabito goes to his school board and he wants to speak about washroom usage by transgender students. And he is, like most parents, not someone who's very active in his school board. He's not someone who watches very often. So he looks up the delegation procedure, he prepares his speech, and he took a lot of care to say all of the right things. Sometimes people do, walk into this domain and maybe they're intentionally or unintentionally saying things that might be considered pretty offensive based on the language that they're using. But in Nick's case, he did a fantastic job of being very sensitive. He wasn't talking about a particular student. He just kind of wanted to say, hey, I don't know about these, biological males using the women's washroom. I'm concerned about this in my kid's school, and have that discussion. And it was 37 seconds into his presentation that he was cut off by the chair of the board and told that he couldn't speak because what he was saying might be, I believe the wording they used was harmful to transgender people. Mm-hmm. And that concerned me, as I just mentioned, because of the way that we're not allowing these conversations to move forward at all. And in my experience, that also makes things worse for everybody, including transgender people, because when we can't have a conversation, people get upset and they get resentful, and it's easy to blame the transgender person, when in this case, it was just that the chair wasn't allowing the conversation to happen. So in that particular case, I decided to make a little video. I made I think about a 3-minute video where I kind of drew attention to this, and it went viral all over the internet. So that was an interesting experience for me, the first time I had a video that went viral. And from there, I just continued making videos.
Yeah.
I guess how one question I kind of have before I go into my prepared question here is, how did you get involved in this issue? Because you said before the case with Nick up in Ottawa, that you were doing this already, that you were doing presentations, it sounds like, to school boards in southwestern Ontario, which is my neck of the woods too. How did you get involved with that? Is this something you've been doing for, a couple of months, a couple of years? And what spurred you to get involved at that level?
Absolutely. Do you want the short version or the medium version or the long version?
Whatever you want.
Yeah. Our producer, Jave, can do all kinds of magic. So don't feel you're constricted to any sort of time constriction.
This means he can make me say things I never said. So that's a bit scary. But I'll give you the medium version.
Sure.
So I'd say my journey in this really began a few years ago. So I have a daughter who is she just finished grade 11, and she's my adopted daughter. So she came to live with me through a family situation about 3 years ago during COVID. And when she came to live with me, she was in online school, and she was in a much smaller community a few hours from where I live. So she was excited to be here because it meant she was going to get to go to a big city high school and get all of the opportunities and scary things for parents that happen in large city schools. So when she entered her grade 10 year, she was going to a school here with me, and I was really concerned about that because I knew what schools were like when I was a kid, and when I had been in high school. If one of my parents or if one of my friends had a transgender parent, I don't think I would have been comfortable with that. I would have made a thing about it. And I thought, is my daughter going to have problems? Is she going to resent me or my identity? Or is it going to just cause her issues in school? And I had no idea how much things have changed in school from when I was in school in the early 2000s and now. So she ends up going to school, and I realized very quickly that I am very cool. It's hip in a certain sense that I'm transgender. And that felt nice for about 2 weeks. And then I thought, wait a minute, like this is concerning, because LGBT issues and matters and identities are like the be all end all in school right now, it seems, in a very fixated way for so many teens. So that was my first wake up call of something odd is going on here in schools. And a few months in January of 2022, there was a teacher in our school board named Carolyn Brzezinski, and she was doing a presentation for our trustees about age-appropriate books. So this was a lot of the concerns that we've heard in many different school boards about certain books in our schools and whether or not they're appropriate for certain ages. And she also had some concerns about some books and whether or not they were potentially encouraging people to go down a transitionary path, or at least diminishing the impacts and the implications of undergoing a surgical or hormonal transition. And so she, as I mentioned, she was a teacher. She brought this to the trustees. And just like the Nick situation, she was shut down a few minutes into her presentation because the chair deemed that it was a violation of the Ontario Human Rights Code to be raising the concerns that she was raising. And like most people, I wasn't watching that live because I had better things to do on a Monday night than watch school board meetings. But about 2 days later, I got an email from the board apologizing for the transphobia that occurred in their meeting. This was sent to everybody who was on the mailing list. And the curiosity in me, I should have probably just left it, but I thought, well, I want to know what happened. I want to see it. We all enjoy some rage sometimes, right? To see what happened. So I hunted down the video on Twitter. It wasn't available on the site because they had pulled it, but I found it on Twitter. And I got to the end of the clip where she was cut off, and I thought there was some missing. My first reaction was there must be more to this clip. She must have said something bad later, and this isn't in this clip. And then I realized, no, she didn't say anything about any particular individual. She didn't say anything that I would think is appropriate to call hate or transphobia. She just simply said, I think that this particular book makes it seem like transition has less impacts than it does, and that may not be a good thing for us to be showing to, a young child or a teenager. And this was early 2022. And I knew that 2022 was a municipal and school board election year for us in Ontario. So because I work in the public sector space. And I thought, oh gosh, this is going to become the issue in our school board. And we're going to see a lot of candidates from the extremes on either side who are going to come in, and that's going to be our election issue. And it was that moment I kind of thought maybe I should be speaking up and joining this conversation, because I am transgender. So I understand the progressive talking points, and I understand in some ways the needs of transgender individuals, but I also have fairly centrist political views. And in this particular case, I thought everything she said was very reasonable, and we should listen to her, and we should consider what she's saying about these books. So I ran a campaign for school board trustee. I ran a fairly quiet campaign at that point because I was still gaining my confidence to really be a public voice in this space. So I kind of put my name out there and thought, we'll see what happens. I did quite well, but I was not elected onto the board. But through that, I met Carolyn, and she's now a close friend of mine, and we chat all the time. And I met a lot of other great people with diverse, religious and political backgrounds who are on either extreme here, and also a lot of people in the middle about how they feel about all of these identity politics in schools and in our politics. And that was really what got me started. And so from that point, I've continued the work that I do in school boards and with other political bodies across Ontario.
Okay, yeah, that's very interesting, because one of the words that was kind of thrown around, and I know that you had just mentioned, talking about Nick, for example, up in Ottawa, was the term harmful. Like, is this harmful? Is what he's saying harmful, therefore he has to be cut off 37 seconds in? Or this teacher and I'm sorry, which school district was that? Was that Cambridge?
That was region of Waterloo.
Waterloo. Okay, so in the Tri-Cities. I was close. So in Waterloo, also being cut off, and said, and an email going out to everyone on the email list saying that, so sorry for, the harmful language regarding this issue. This person's transphobic, which you, as someone who is trans, didn't appear to find anything transphobic in there. So it's interesting that, this word kind of gets thrown around. And I guess like kind of one question that we have is the exploration of truth, especially on issues that are relatively, and I think we can agree that these issues are relatively new, should it be automatically assumed that those who question it are automatically causing harm to the transgender community? Or as someone who is transgender, is there utility to allowing this space to have these discussions, especially at something like a school board level?
Yeah, one thing I have learned in the work that I've been doing here for the past 2 years is how much it depends on language and the definitions that you're using and how you hold a word like harm and what you decide that means. And as we've seen postmodern deconstructive ideologies come into place, harm has really transitioned to be systematic. So when people in that space often refer to harm, what they mean is it perpetuates a systematic oppression of one sort or the other. And if that's your definition of harm, then I guess maybe you can justify it. But if that's your definition of harm, then basically anything can be justified as harm. I personally prefer to appeal to a much more classical definition of harm, which is going to be, kind of an overt act against an individual, often physical. It doesn't have to be physical. But in that particular case, no, if somebody's discussing, kind of policies and academic topics, generally speaking, that's not about me in particular, and we're disagreeing on whether or not, who should use a washroom or who should be in a particular sports league or what books should be in a library, I don't personally think it's appropriate to use the word harm in any of those conversations.
Now, you've spoken in some of your interviews about a friend who is currently detransitioning, and not only is she detransitioning, but she's now suing her doctor, I think, because she regrets it. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this situation and if it's affected your worldview at all when it comes to this issue.
Yeah, there are detransitioners out there. I think for a long time they didn't have much attention at all on them. And I think there's been more efforts recently to draw attention to the fact that people do detransition. And from the onset, I want to kind of clarify the difference between what we might refer to as a desister and a detransitioner. So a desister is going to be somebody who maybe professes some sort of a cross-gender identity, doesn't actually go down any surgical hormonal route, and then changes their mind later. So they've kind of changed their course, but in a sense, no, I don't want to use the word, well, I'm going to use the word damage. No damage has been done because they had adopted a new name and pronouns and then they switch back again. That's very common. We're seeing that a lot. And personally, I don't think there's a huge risk to that. That's people experimenting, trying to see what works and what fits. It's when we get into the point where surgical or hormonal steps are being taken that people might regret. And you can only back those out so far. The hormones do things that are irreversible, and surgeries by definition are irreversible as well. And so once those steps have been taken, there's a huge impact. And there have always been people who detransition. For a long time, the narrative was that people who detransition do so because it's so hard to be transgender in our society. So they might transition, and the problem is not that they weren't happy with their transition. The problem was that it's really difficult to be transgender. And those people absolutely exist. And I do know some of them as well. But in the last 10 or 15 years, we are seeing more and more detransitioners who regret it, and they're angry, and they're blaming the medical system for not essentially properly vetting them. And that lines up quite logically with the change that we have made in our process for allowing people to transition. So 15 years ago, the bar was quite high in order to get to the point that you would be enabled to go through a hormonal or surgical transition, because we didn't want to make a mistake. And some might argue that it's been too high in the past. I would argue it's been too high at some points in the past. But in the last 15 years, we have reached a point where we've flipped entirely the other way. We've said, this is identity. Nobody knows but you. And thus we can't question it. So when a kid or an adult comes and says that I identify this way, the doctors don't question, because that's deemed conversion therapy. You're trying to convert them out of it rather than potentially just vetting to see if this is the right fit for you. So we see a lot of people who have other comorbidities. They might be bipolar or borderline personality disorder. They might have autism. They have other emotional and psychosocial matters in their life. And this is a complex soup, right? Were those caused by gender dysphoria? Is there feelings of dysphoria caused by those other comorbidities? That's a complex puzzle, and we're not vetting it, which means we are certainly going to have some cases where people end up regretting the decisions that they make. So with my friend, that's the case. She does have certain comorbidities that I won't name because I don't know what she wants me to share, but she had certain things going on there. And she actually transitioned as an adult. I think she was 21 when she started. So she was young. She had these other conditions that were not really vetted out, but she wasn't even a kid. What I find much scarier is that we do have people who are under 18 who are undergoing hormones and surgery. And even then, I'm not unilaterally opposed to it in all cases, but the way we used to do it, it was a very, very high bar to vet. The way we do it now is, best.
It reminds me of a story that we covered a few months ago on this podcast. Alyssa, you probably recall an Indigenous transgendered woman from Alberta. Is that correct, Lois?
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Julia, you're talking about this timeline of around 15 years, and this story kind of perfectly goes with that timeline. So something was happening in the province of Alberta, I think back in 2009, in that these sex reassignment surgeries weren't going to be offered for much longer, or there was a funding issue or something like that.
Yeah.
And all of these healthcare professionals in Alberta were putting tremendous pressure on Lois to get this done. And I think Lois at the time was around 18, maybe just under, maybe just over, but somewhere in around there. And went through with it, went to Montreal to get it done, came back and found that it didn't really fix the issue, whether it be the dysphoria or the other issues. And like you said, maybe there are other comorbidities, maybe other mental health, like mental health issues attached to it that's really was pushing that, as opposed to the dysphoria itself. And then, try to, over the years and recently, say like, hey, like I want to detransition. I want to, kind of go back or get back to some sort of state that I feel more comfortable in regarding, the male-female sex dynamic. And what was offered instead from the government was assisted suicide. So now we're rushing all these relatively young people, because I'm in my 30s, so I now consider 18 to be young. This is 15 years ago, mind you. Never mind now, right? Mm-hmm. Putting in this immense pressure on people to go through either with hormonal or surgical changes. And then when that doesn't fix the problem, so to speak, instead of actually addressing the issue, which probably should have been done in the first place, it is, oh, you can just go and kill yourself, no problem. It seems to me like I don't know what you think of this, Julia, and I don't know if you would agree with this type of terminology, and I don't even know if this is technically medically the right terminology, but it seems to me that when you look at different polls of people who identify as part of LGBTQ whatever, and you break it down by age cohorts in North America, it's something like close to 20% for those of Generation Z, so those born from 1995 onward, whereas most other generations, you're well over 10%. It seems to me that this is a bit of a social contagion, and one of the issues with that is when minors go through this and there isn't that high level of bar, and healthcare professionals are terrified because of Bill C-4, the conversion therapy, of not actually addressing the issue or the other issues that are driving this. It seems to me that years from now, and I don't think that many years from now, you're going to have this basically giant class action lawsuit from all these people who were younger, who are now maybe in their 30s or 40s, that can't detransition like Lois. They're going to sue. And of course, who are they going to sue? They're going to sue the entity that was most responsible for this, that has the biggest pockets, and that's the government. Do you foresee, like, first off, I guess, like, would you describe this as a potential social contagion? And secondly, maybe not using that term, but if you think that's kind of what's happening, do you see that this could be a potential consequence down the road?
Yeah. First of all, I'm so happy that you talked to Lois. She's a friend of mine. So
unfortunately, we weren't able to talk to her.
We just follow it all on Twitter.
Yeah. It really, when Alyssa and I read about it, we texted about it, called about it, and it was like, this is horrible. Like the whole story, right from beginning to end, from what we can tell. Of course, we didn't talk to Lois, so maybe there's things that we're missing in there, but we were just kind of horrified that this was the situation for the last 15 years, and this is the solution that was being proposed.
Well, you should talk to her. I can hook you up with her if you'd like.
That'd be great. Yeah.
But no, I yes to everything that you said there. I I'm perfectly comfortable using the word social contagion because I think that's a very appropriate term for what we're seeing. Keeping in mind that what we're seeing is two different things. People have been severely gender dysphoric for as long as we've known. Like, this is something that's gone on for many years. This is what I felt as a kid. I didn't transition as a kid. I transitioned at 28 and I felt it the entire way through, and it was intense and it was debilitating. And people like me have existed. But what we've seen in the last 10 or 15 years has been this exponential growth of individuals who fall into a very different pattern. I think probably the most salient way to see that is that when I was a child, 75% of people who were transitioning were biologically male, transitioning to present as women. And what we've seen now is a complete reversal. I think it's 80% of all people are biologically female looking to transition to present as men. But it's not that the others have decreased. We actually see more biological males as well. It's just that we've seen such a huge proportion of teenage girls come in who want to transition. And it's the same story again and again and again. These are individuals who right around puberty, sometime between 10 and 13, they end up being uncomfortable with their body and they decide that they want to transition. And we often see comorbidities that sit there as well. And we see other factors here. But as you described, we're not betting it out because we don't want to be accused of conversion therapy. And in my case, I work with a lot of families and I work with a lot of youth as well. I've been off Twitter for the past few weeks because I've had a personal matter going on that I haven't yet shared with anybody, but I have had two teenagers staying with me who are biologically female and they're transgender. And during this period, they're both under 18. One of them received their approval for testosterone and received their approval for a mastectomy that they're going to have before the end of the year. And I found that devastating because as I came to know these two teenagers, I've come to love them and care about them. And I also see the comorbidities. I see all of these things in their life, all these struggles they've had their whole life, the way that they've been treated, they had abuse and other factors, and seeing that translate into latching on to identity, but no one's touching that and supporting them or vetting out whether this is the right fit. Maybe it is. I certainly don't want to tell anybody it can't be the right choice for them, but I also know people who regret it. I know people who have detransitioned.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, let's talk about the schools, because I know that you've been with Billboard Chris in some recent protests, and you have also, what really caught my attention are the two videos, or maybe even more, that you made about Premier Higgs and what's happening in New Brunswick, which I have personally been interviewed about on, Radio Canada and CBC and other publications that want to spin a certain narrative. So I'm really happy to see that you're speaking out. And I'm just wondering, why do you support parental involvement in social transition? And also, why do you believe that so many people within the transgender community don't?
Ooh, two tough questions. It's late here and you're just going to throw all the tough ones at me.
Good cop, bad cop.
Yeah. Yeah. So why do I care? I care because it is not a neutral act, plain and simple. That's the argument that we see put forward often is, this is a neutral act, right? Calling a kid Julia rather than Jason and just using she pronouns rather than he. It's just, it doesn't matter. It's like a kid saying, I'm a firefighter today when they're playing out in the playground and go, okay, you're a firefighter. Like, who cares? It's kind of the attitude that often gets thrown. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that's true. One, just because logically it doesn't really make sense that that's true. If it doesn't matter, then why do we have to do it? Mm-hmm. But also because I've experienced it. I did not go through a childhood transition, but I went through an adult transition. And when I started down this path, I did what most people do. If you start with some kind of a small circle of people who are going to affirm you. So my family didn't know yet, my employer didn't know, and most of my friends didn't know, but I had this little inner bubble who did know. And so I would be Jason at work, and then I would go home and I would be Julia. And very quickly, I didn't want to be with those other people because I didn't want to be called Jason. That made me so angry now because I'm Julia, but you don't know that, so you're calling me Jason. And my work doesn't know that. And so I would latch closer on to those people who are calling me she, her, and who are calling me Julia. And that's not neutral. And so when we do that with a child, they're more likely to latch onto this identity. I think it often gets compared to being gay in a way that's unhelpful, because when you are talking about a sexual identity, you don't wear this on your face. I've known many people who are gay or lesbians who very regularly don't profess that, right? If they're in a situation where that is going to be unpopular or uncomfortable for them, if they're crossing the border into a state that's maybe, a little bit hostile, this is my friend. They don't have to say it's my girlfriend or my boyfriend. Nobody needs to know. You can hide that. But when you're going to adopt a cross-gender identity, you're wearing that on your face. Everybody knows, which means it's somewhat difficult to back out. Once you have held on to that tightly, it's not trivial to just reverse it in some cases. So that's my first concern here, is that this can be a big step. And we've seen that in the literature and the research over the years, that many times young children might profess some sort of cross-gender identity. Almost always they grow out of it when they don't transition. But if we put them into that social transition place and we say, yeah, you're a girl now. Okay, great. We're going to dress you like a girl. We're going to call you a girl name. Then they often don't desist. And for me, that comes down to, it's better to not be transgender if you can not be transgender. And I think that's where I disagree with a lot of the common narratives here, that for a lot of people, they view this as a diversity thing. It's finding your true self. And so all answers are right. You're a clean slate. Go out into the world and find the identity that works for you and be that thing. And I don't buy that, because when you transition, it is medically risky and it is expensive and it's stigmatized. And there's a lot of reasons not to do it. Infertility, that is not very pleasant when your partner has to go through IVF. And so if a kid could transition or they could not transition and they could be happy either way, personally, I'd say we should not transition that kid. We absolutely should not transition that child. If someone is truly at a breaking point that they just cannot cope, okay, well, then maybe we should look at transition at that point. And so because of that, I don't want to jump into this, cavalierly. Then, of course, we go to the next step, though, with social transitions, which is, I don't know what it's like out in your area, but in Ontario here, many of our schools, actually all of our schools, except for one school board in Ontario, they have policies in place that if the child does not want the parents to know, then they will transition them at school and not tell the parents. Mm-hmm. And people don't know this is happening. When you talk to parents, people are shocked, right? People think that when we talk about transgender acceptance, we just mean common dignity and kindness towards other humans, which I think we can all get behind. But what's actually happening in our schools here is that if a child does not want their parent to know, then the school will take a concerted effort not to tell the parents. They will tell the whole class, okay, Jason is now Julia, and they'll tell all the other teachers so everybody knows, because we want to affirm this kid, so we want to give the kid everything they want. But they'll also have a procedure in place to make sure that if the parent calls into the office knows, but when you talk to the parents, you call them Jason, and then you call in and you talk. It's this big game that they're playing. And that is, I don't know how someone can hear that and not be concerned about that, to be quite honest.
Yeah.
We live in a world that grows through communication.
Every connection comes from a dream to be heard and realized.
To welcome a better future. What are your dreams?
LaRosse Media will help communicate your vision through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Start building connections to your future audience. Visit larossemedia.com
and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with LaRosse Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.
I think a lot of people are waking up, and Julia, you might not know this about our podcast, but it is a political podcast, so I have to ask you a political question, because what we're seeing in New Brunswick, that's the change they're trying to make, right? That's the change that, well, not they're trying, they did make it. That's the change they made through a ministerial directive, the Minister of Education, for Policy 713. And it's caused this big uproar in New Brunswick, but good on Blaine Higgs. He seems to really adopt that issue, and he's pushing forward for it. And, when the Prime Minister is asked about it, the Prime Minister comes hard against Blaine Higgs, despite the fact that there has been a ton of polling on it, but the polling that has come forward, there's basically a super majority across the country that supports Premier Higgs in New Brunswick on this very simple policy. For those of you who don't know, Policy 713 in New Brunswick was what you described, Julia, that right across the province of New Brunswick, that social transition in the classroom would be not known to parents, but now for any child that is 16 years or younger, you have to get that approval from the parents first. So you have to include parents in that process, or at least have them notified. So it's interesting because obviously, the Prime Minister is on one side, you have Premier Higgs on another side, and I know that he's not in government, but when you have the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre, asked about it, he says, education issues should just be dealt with provinces, which is kind of a non-answer. So I guess as someone who is in this fight, especially at the school board level, what would your advice be to politicians who are reluctant to touch this issue, especially when it's brought up either by caucus members or members of the media, even though these debates are obviously becoming much more regular and far more public, especially what we've seen in the past year?
Yeah, I was not involved in politics until a year and a half ago, and now I have all kinds of meetings with MPs and ministers. So it's a domain that I've come to learn about very quickly. And I do find that the closed-door conversations are very different than things that are being said publicly with a lot of the individuals in all the parties. This isn't even a one-party thing. It's people understand the concerns, but they're scared to touch this issue because we have made identity politics something you just don't touch. And I do believe that social transition in schools is going to be one of the first ones that we're going to be able to touch. As you said, there's a supermajority who is in favor of this. It's just so common sense to say we can transition kids in school if it's the right fit, but knowing if it's the right fit requires involving the parents and it involves the healthcare system, which is bridged by the parents. And so for the school to do that on their own is just kind of insane. And so I do think we're going to get there. I think it's going to take time, though, for the politicians to find confidence, to understand that this is something they can touch, unlike so many of the other identity politic matters that really we've created a cancel culture that hasn't allowed those conversations to move forward.
You joined, like I mentioned it earlier, but you did join Billboard Chris at some protests in Ottawa regarding some of the Ottawa school board policies around gender ideology, and one of those policies was opting out of LGBT learning, which is not an option. And then some teachers were told, in order to foster inclusivity, to begin the school year using the pronouns they, them, for everybody, basically. Billboard Chris, somewhat of a polarizing figure, I think getting a lot more support within this last year. You probably, from what I can tell, you get hate a little bit on one side and hate a little bit on the other side. So I'm just wondering, why did you feel that it was important to join Billboard Chris in this specific protest in Ottawa?
Yeah, I don't think I've actually told this story yet on a podcast, so this will be fun.
Breaking news.
Good, yeah. Good question, Alyssa.
Exclusive.
Yeah. No, so I didn't know what to think of Billboard Chris. I was certainly skeptical going into Ottawa as well. I went up there because I'm part of the conversations in this space, and so I certainly wanted to be there. But I didn't know what I was going to do. And I told a lot of the people I was going to see, and I don't know if I'm going to protest. I definitely want to be there for all the networking opportunities before and after, but I may just sit out the day of the protest. And I wasn't sure what was going to come of it. But the night before, do you know Chanel Fall? Is she someone who's come up on your...
Yeah, we follow her. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So she's a good friend of mine. And so I was with her at a private gathering with Chris the night before. Mm-hmm. So there was, 30, 35 of us there. He did a big presentation. So we kind of got like the 2-hour spiel of what he does and why he does it. And then we got time to talk to him one-on-one. And I stayed there quite late. So I had some really great conversations with him. And I really liked what I heard and what I saw from him. I didn't follow him before that on Twitter. So all I had seen was, the most extreme examples of what happens that makes its way through my feed through tons of shares. And I had read him as very provocative, like, oh, you just go out there and stand there so that people will attack you so that you can make a big stink about it. And what he told, I called him out on that. I kind of said, is this what you're doing? And he said, like, no, he's been attacked like 4 or 5 times or something ever. And he's had 15,000 conversations and 5 of them have been attacks. And he's like, yeah, and those are the ones that other people choose to share the most, but he shares, many other conversations too, which I've now seen is true. Yeah. He does share lots of other conversations. And so I really liked the nuance that he had. Some of the things he was saying to us the night before was, we need to make sure that people don't have, fuck Trudeau signs and things like that at this rally. That is not this purpose. This is not politics. This is about one particular issue. And we need to have dignity, in terms of how we're bringing that forward and raising that issue. And it was really that opportunity to get to know him that made me comfortable kind of being there and throwing some support behind him. Though I did also say at the time, I don't agree on everything. I don't think any of us agree with anybody on everything. And there's certainly things I disagree with Chris on, but at the same time, I can appreciate the importance of the issue that he's raising.
Awesome. So was that the first a public protest on this issue that you, well, obviously this is the first one you've been a part of, but is this the first one that you observed as well, like in person?
The first major one, I'm not a protester, not really my jam. So I've been around a few small ones locally, but really I try to bridge, not protest. So
yeah, no, and that's fair enough. And like for our pro-life organization, like we don't do protests. We get involved right in the political process for nominations and things like that. And there is a difference. And I think there's places for certain things, but it's just interesting to me, Julia, because and maybe Alyssa, you want to get on this as well. It seems to me in like this past school year, right, this past academic year from September 2022 to June 2023 in Canada, and it seems to me that's happening more in Canada than the United States, but maybe there's more of a required response in Canada than the United States, that there are more and more of these protests happening. And especially in the month of June for obvious reasons. And I don't recall seeing this really being a thing in the past. And when I look at videos of the protests, I'm not saying like everyone who is at the protest on both sides is behaving properly, but it seems to be getting steam. It seems to be growing larger. It's not really happening, in rural Western Canada, rural Ontario. It's happening like in like urban centers like Toronto and Mississauga and where you were in Ottawa. And when you look at pictures and videos of it, it's not just white Christian straight males that are out there, which they're there, but it seems to me, maybe I wasn't at the protest in Ottawa, so maybe I'm wrong, but looking at it, there's Muslims and there's Sikhs and there's a lot of women and even a lot of students that just seem to be uncomfortable with what's happening in the high schools in particular. So I'm just curious from your perspective, Julia, like we have you on this podcast right now talking about this issue where, on the Venn diagram of this issue, it's not a perfect circle, but it's probably going to be pretty big in the middle. It seems to me like there's this broad, winning, growing, diverse coalition of saying, whoa, pump the brakes on this. Like, let's actually have a conversation from a logical, basically non-emotive place. So I'm curious, like, is that something that you are starting to see? Is that something you're starting to feel and pick up on? Or is it more of like the typical type of people that maybe a lot of people in legacy media would paint it as?
That's a tricky question. I think there is a lot of diversity of people who are standing up and raising concerns here. As you said, there's certainly people who have certain religious kind of religious. There's certain people who are coming from a religious place in terms of bringing their concerns, although there are various religions that lead to that. You get radical feminists, you get people who might be conservative but not coming from a religious place, and you're also seeing more people who are in what we would call classical liberalism, which is where I would sit,
right.
Which 30 years ago would have solidly been within the Liberal Party in Canada, and now the Liberal Party has very much moved into progressivism, so I kind of feel homeless because I don't have a place anymore. But you see that as well. So I do think that there is diversity, which is good. The one concern I would raise from that I have seen at the same time, though, is that also means that it can mask some of the hate that does exist there. There certainly are people who raise these concerns for hateful reasons. And I think they're not always, sometimes they're allowed to kind of coexist within the movement, which is, in my opinion, deleterious to the progression of it, because they stand with us in places like Ottawa, but there was hateful activity on both sides that I was able to observe. And that detracts from, the movement I would love to see when there are people who are throwing hate at one another.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested in kind of the bigger nuance of what's happening within different communities. So, for example, today the Toronto Star came out with an article talking about how they really want to prevent the Toronto District School Board from parents being able to opt out of the drag queen story hour that's happening in the schools. There's yes.
You can do it right here, right now.
Yeah. And I thought that this was particularly interesting because, I do like TikTok. I go on it and I see a lot of different people within the LGBT community speaking about this, because originally the community was talking about being equal. They just wanted equality. And now it's turned into we're going to target schools specifically, and there's no way out. Like, you have to believe this. You have to say this. You have to go to this event. Even in Alberta, I'm in Alberta, there was a recent story of an Edmonton teacher who yelled at Muslim students for going to the mall instead of their pride events or whatever. So this is no longer like treat us
told
equally.
To go back.
Yeah, and that you don't belong in Canada was what she said. So this has kind of progressed from being treated equally, which I feel like everyone can agree with and get behind, and that was achieved, to now like pushing a certain ideology on people and having no way out. And I'm just wondering, why do you think there has been this shift in this sort of strategy, I guess?
Yeah, there's so much I want to comment on that. Every time you say something, I'm like, we could talk for hours, but so I'm going to say like 5 things here and you can decide what you want to keep. Yes, I have seen that same trend myself. For me, I saw it around pride flags. So I made a few videos about pride. The first one was in May. There was a small middle of nowhere community called Norwich. It's about 45 minutes from where I live here. And this is a village. Like, they have a Tim Hortons and it's a crossroad. There's nothing there, but I know it because I used to live close to it. And they decided not to have pride flags this year because they've had vandalism problems. They've had people who are upset. And they kind of said, we're just going to avoid the whole thing. We're just going to do the federal, provincial, municipal flags, nothing else. And this became a news story all over Ontario because people are so outraged that they're not going to have a pride flag. And I made a video about that it went very viral because the way I saw it, if you mandate pride flags, if we essentially make a municipality have a pride flag and act as though to not have one is hateful, then it's compelled. And if it's compelled, then it's meaningless because it's not an effort of anything. It's just, I did this because I had to do it. And for me, it was quite impactful because I used to work in the municipal space, and I worked in a municipality where we had a very homophobic mayor who would be, saying slurs up in the chambers in front of me as a staff member directly before going down and raising the flag that he had to raise because, that's what he felt he had to do politically. And what matters is the sentiment and the respect we have for one another, not whether or not we have a flag raised or something of that sort. But we have seemed to reach this place where it's so strong that to not do it is deemed as hateful. And that's what I've seen with the drag queen story hours, as you said as well. And I don't know if you've seen my videos on that. I made a few back a few months ago. That's another issue I don't understand. I think drag queen, I think drag is kind of offensive in general. I think it, really perpetuates regressive female stereotypes, but for children, I definitely don't see the benefit of it. And so I made these videos about it to explore that issue. And when I did my research, what the progressive side was saying was that, well, this is a way to, really promote, gender positivity with children and show them diversity. And I thought, well, like, if you really want to show kids diversity, you should show them the diversity that actually exists. Like, bring me into the classroom and we can just read a normal story and not sexualize it. And, that would be okay. But that's not what we're doing. We're putting people into these, these costumes and, plastering them with makeup and presenting in a provocative way. And I don't see how that helps anybody. But for some reason, people have latched onto it so tightly and they you can't challenge that. And as you said, the Toronto District School Board is now looking at, do we make that mandatory? And I don't understand the justification for how we can. I haven't done my research because I haven't made my video on that particular one. So check in with me on a few days and maybe I'll have more to say.
Sounds good.
That sounds good. I have a follow-up question too. Sorry, this is from a couple questions ago, so I apologize, and maybe we'll cut this out, Dave. I don't know, but I think it's important to talk about because I think it's important for people to hear who listen to our podcast who are maybe interested in perhaps going to a protest for it, because this is happening at school boards all across the country. I mean, even my hometown of Brandon in Manitoba, which is probably somewhere between the population of Norwich and London or something like that. It's like the size of Sarnia, for example. Sleepy, kind of calm, middle of the road Brandon had this huge school board meeting. They had to move it from the school board office into one of the high school gyms because there were so many people that showed up about I think probably objectively not appropriate books being shown in classrooms to kids as young as 7 or 8 or 9 years old. So this is, I think going forward, like seeing protests in front of school board district offices, especially school boards where trustees just cut people off and don't let them speak about their very legitimate issues. I think this is going to be more of a trend. But when you said that when you were in Ottawa and you saw hate on both sides, could you please define that a little bit and maybe give some examples of what that looked like? Because I think if people are planning to go to protests, because I think it's going to be a thing in the coming academic year 2 or 3, it's probably good to kind of know from your perspective, like, what does that actually look like? Because I think a lot of people, I would like to think a lot of people who are going to these protests would not have the intention of being untoward or unkind to someone such as yourself, Julia. I like to think that, at least.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I wish I'd explained that better earlier. When I say hate on both sides, it is the minority by far. Just like harm, I think the word hate is being used in ways that are entirely inappropriate. For me, I will call it hate when it is contempt and disdain directed towards me as a person directly, not someone believes something I don't like. Someone, goes after me as a person with contempt. And I do get that on both sides. I get that from a lot of trans rights activists because they have a very rigid, dogmatic idea of how we should handle trans matters. And I align with them on some things, but I don't align with them on other things. And if you don't toe that narrative in its entirety, then they get very offended and they make it very personal. So I've had cancellation attempts against me. Back in March, they tried to go after my directorship on our local food bank. So this was actually the first time I was going to go to Ottawa. I was going to meet with
why?
well, that's the thing, right? One of the reasons I survived that cancellation attempt is because our community was sane enough to know that withholding food security from our most marginalized citizens to get back at a director who, support some people you don't like is not good for our community, and people understood that. But all I was doing here was going to talk to Chanel Fall. I was going to Ottawa to do a recording at her house, and people found that very threatening, right? Because I shouldn't talk to someone like her. She is transphobic, or so they say. I don't find her transphobic at all, but that's how she's been labeled. And so by me talking to her, I am threatening to uncancel her, and that's a huge threat. So they go after me. So I get that kind of, hate acts against me. And that manifests itself in lots of comments that come my way. I've gotten very used to filtering those out on all my social media accounts. And on the other side, the same thing, right? There are people who genuinely who genuinely hold contempt towards someone like me because of the fact that I present the way that I do. It's not about washrooms or prisons or schools, or maybe it is about those things too, but it also is simply they're offended by the fact that I call myself Julia and that I dress the way that I do. And so I get lots of comments and slurs thrown at me as well. And that's the stuff I'm comfortable calling hate, when it really is contempt towards me. So when I'm at a protest like Ottawa, very, very, very small amount. Like this was, it's the 1%. Mostly it's exactly what you described as people who are there on principles on either side. But those issues do attract out more extreme individuals as well.
Okay, yeah, that's good to know.
Now, Scott and I were talking earlier, and he had found this. I have yet to find it, but you were speaking at a school board meeting, and one of the trustees wanted you to admit publicly that you were part of the fringe minority or something like that. I'd like to try and find that video.
The minority within the minority is I think what you called it, Julia.
Oh,
yes,
okay.
I can point you towards that. That's my friend Scott Piakuski at Waterloo Region District School Board.
Sounds like a great guy. What should students, parents, and the community members do in general regarding, the school board and getting involved in the school board and talking specifically about, these types of gender ideologies in the schools?
The reality is, delegating in school boards doesn't do anything. And I say that as somebody who has delegated countless times in many boards across Ontario. But you register as a delegation, you go to the school board, you're given sometimes it's 3 minutes, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 10, depending on the board's rules, to present on a topic. Some boards
37
you can talk about
seconds.
you want. 37 seconds, exactly. Some boards you have to be a resident. Some boards you have to speak to an item that's on the agenda. So you have to get very good at knowing how you can tie this into something that's on the agenda and be like, well, you're talking about mental health. And as it turns out, so am I. And then, see how long you can go. It's a bit of a game in that sense, but ultimately you do your presentation and they don't need to do anything from there. They can choose to. So a lot of the school boards that I work with, I'm there because I have allies on the board. I work with a lot of trustees, and these trustees want me there. And so they're prepared to bring a motion forward afterwards and say, I would like this to happen or that to happen, which may or may not pass, but then the political process can at least do its thing. If you are speaking in front of a hostile board but nobody wants you there, then they're going to listen to you and you're going to be stopped, and then they're just not going to do anything from it anyways. So I do it because it raises awareness. And that's about it. The political process that needs to happen is at the provincial and the federal levels. That's much more difficult. That involves working with the MPs and the ministers directly, which is happening, but they're difficult conversations to have. The other thing I would say about school boards is, if you're working with a more hostile school board, like what you were talking about there with my friend Scott Piakowski at Waterloo, you've got to be ready for some challenges. So on that particular delegation, I did a 10-minute delegation. It was about social transition. So exactly what we were talking about earlier of changing your names and pronouns in the classroom without parental knowledge. And I then faced 25 minutes of questions. They weren't questions; they were interrogations. I was treated as a hostile witness by these trustees, and I'm prepared to do that. This is the domain that I work in. So I read the books, I know the studies, I can handle that. But if you don't know the human rights code and you don't know a lot of this stuff, it can be very challenging because they have their computers in front of them as they're pulling up, trying to get gotchas to catch you. And so in that sense, you do need to be ready if you're going to go and delegate. I don't think it's helpful to delegate out of emotion. I've seen lots of people who might have strong feelings, but they get up there and they're not able to play the political game that you have to play in these situations.
It's interesting because I think to some degree I disagree with you, and in some ways I do agree with you. I agree with you that delegating to school boards to enact actual policy change directly from that at the school board level, 99 times out of 100, if not 999 times out of 1,000, is not going to work. Where I disagree with you is that it is, I think it is helpful. So like from someone who is involved in political campaigns, and Alyssa, my colleague here, is way stronger at this because Alyssa is more of the wordsmith, right? Way better than I am.
Sorry. My daughter just walked in. Here, say hello. Really quick, say hi. Okay, go see Daddy. He's going to be in trouble. Okay, go upstairs, please. Sorry, I'm very sorry. Yeah. Okay, go. Okay. Sorry.
That's fine. Anastasia will be next. But she won't have any clothes coming in probably. And anyway, like it's where I guess I would disagree with you is that as someone who is involved in politics, having those delegations, if they're done right, like you said, like they're from a non-emotive space, I imagine most of the stuff, and I could be wrong on this, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I imagine most of the stuff coming at you, Julia, would be probably pretty repetitive. Like I know for what Alyssa and I do when we, because obviously we're pro-life organization, so we engage with people who are pro-abortion. It's like the same talking points from the 1970s. So you just bat it away, and eventually you memorize the answers because it's the same stuff coming at you. But so I guess if you're prepared for that, what I'm saying is that it is useful because those clips, especially if you can get, those 30 to 60 second clips from these meetings out of the 10-minute presentation and the plus the extra 25-minute interrogation from that half hour, if you get like 2 or 3 30-second clips, that's huge because you can use that if you want to run a slate of pro-parental right, let's call that, candidates in the next municipal election for the board. You can use that clip, say, here's what this candidate said, this is what this candidate said. Like you're building an inventory, a library, if you will, of all the crazy shit that people are saying at the school board level. That being said, something that you brought up that I think is really important is that I think this affects all 3 levels of government, particularly the provincial and municipal government. Municipal, obviously, because it's at the school board level. Provincially, because under the British North America Act, public education is the domain of the provincial crowns. So, let's say, Alyssa here is the Minister of Education for Ontario. So, sorry, Stephen Lecce, you're kicked out. It's now Alyssa. Yeah.
I don't want it.
What would you say to Alyssa as, here are like the 2 or 3 or 5 things that you can do as minister or as a government that has a massive majority in Queen's Park, for example. And of course, this would then apply not just to Ontario, but basically every other province out there. What are things that provincial governments can do, provincial ministers of education can do today to alleviate the situation, let's say, that we're seeing in the high schools and elementary schools too, mind you?
I think the most important thing that they could be doing and should be doing would be to bring some balance back to remembering that we need to protect everybody's rights, and that comes from all sides. And that does have to, if we look at the LGBT domain specifically, because I know a lot of our conversation is centralizing there, that does involve looking at what does, say, a transgender student need in order to be accepted in their class and in order to be able to have dignity in their school. And that is important. That hasn't always been the case. It certainly wasn't when I was a kid. So that does matter. But that's not the only right that needs to be protected. We also need to protect parental rights, to have the right to parent their child and know what's going on. We have to protect freedom of speech rights so that people who disagree with certain things can have those conversations. And all of those matter. And I think that's where I personally vary from some of the other, I don't like to call myself an activist, but some of the other activists who I know, where it's they get focused on an issue like transgender rights, and that's all that they see. And I do see that. I see lots of risks that could, challenge my right to exist as I do. And that scares me. But I also see that compelled speech is bad. And I don't want to live in a place where we compel speech. And if I don't want my speech compelled, then I can't make your speech be compelled. Mm-hmm. And I want to have rights as a parent to parent my child and to protect her from the things that I think are truly harmful to her. And if I want that right for my child, then I can't tell you that you don't get to have that right for your child. And just kind of recognizing that all of these, the complexity comes here together, and we can't look at this as just one thing. Like it's just about protecting transgender students, or if we bring in some of the other identity politics, it's just about finding equitability for racialized students, or it's just about any of those other domains.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have one final question for you, Julia, and it's probably the most important question that we've discussed so far. And that is, how did you learn to carve a turtle out of watermelon? And can you carve any other animals?
Oh, okay. So I have a video that you've obviously seen. I put it up a few weeks ago. That was my goodbye for a while Twitter video. Yeah. As I mentioned, I had some students coming to stay with me, and I can't tell the story of who they are or why they were here, because that's the kind of their confidential business. But I knew this was going to be a very challenging situation for me because they were transgender, and I did not want the work that I do to get in the way of their stability and their comfort in my house. So that, along with a few other reasons of just Twitter being a horrible, toxic pile of mud, I decided to pull away for a while. And I didn't have time to make a goodbye video. So I looked through my collection, and I have this video from, maybe 7 or 8 years ago of me carving a watermelon turtle. This was pre-transition. And I have a friend, actually it was Chanel, who told me she tried to watch the video really slow to see pictures of what I look like pre-transition, because there's one frame where you can kind of see my beard and stuff. And and I was like, oh, I haven't shown you pictures. And I sent her pictures back, because I'm not shy about that. But anyways, to answer your question, I really thought that it was a fun thing to bring to potlucks. When you have to bring food, I don't just want to bring a watermelon. I want to bring an awesome watermelon. 10 years ago, I bought all these tools, because you can get these shaper things that have all the right edges to do carving and stuff, because fruit carving is apparently a thing. And I'm self-taught in that respect.
Wow.
That's cool. I got to learn to do that. My kids love watermelon, so. Oh,
that's so good. I have a giant one over there. Maybe I will carve it into something for you. No promises though.
Awesome. Well, we just want to say thank you so much for having these discussions with us. A lot of times there is no space to have these discussions on either side of the aisle. So I really appreciate you coming on, and for your videos and the work that you do. So thank you so much, and keep in touch, and we hope to talk to you soon.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me. This has been fun.
Thank you for joining us for this week's episode of the Stinking Albatross. Make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, basically anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can be alerted when a new episode comes out. Like I said, we'll be interviewing guests throughout the summer, so you don't want to miss that. And thank you for joining us, and we'll talk to you soon.
Nature communicates with us in a universal language. The sunrise starts a new day. The sunset marks our accomplishments.
The most beautiful communication is where the speaker and the listener match perfectly and understand the same message.
Your future audience is waiting to hear from you. What message do you need to share?
At La Ross Media, we fashion beautiful communications through our professional video production services and marketing strategies.
Create your own most beautiful message. Visit larossmedia.com and be sure to check out our extended service options.
Dream, produce, market, succeed with La Ross Media.
Serving Canada from coast to coast to coast.